Kenneth Anderson with the Hoover Institution, also the author of Living with the UN, American Responsibilities and International Order. Thank you so much, sir, for coming on the program tonight.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I read your piece, Why Does the UN Still Exist? And I had to chuckle because we've been covering the UN Arms Trade Treaty negotiations that have been going underway for the last 3 weeks or for the last 20-plus years, depending on how you look at it. And I know that there are a lot of folks who listen to this program who are wondering, why does the UN still exist? It doesn't seem to do much, and what it doesn't seem to do very well. And yet, it sort of exists because it says it has to.
Yeah, I think the thing about the UN is that it consists of a lot of contradictions all baked into a pie which nobody can eat. And so you've got an institution which says we are the organ for governing the globe, but we're actually just a collection of member states. We have a Secretary General who, at least under the last Secretary General, Kofi Annan, was kind of regarded by a lot of people as a weak president of the world. But anytime any trouble came up, he said, well, I'm just the humble minister of the states that make up the membership. The UN is supposed to consist of actual values that are written into the UN Charter, but in fact anybody can join. Any state can join, no matter how terrible they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so it consists of all these things that are basically these polar opposites baked into the same pie. But the most important of them is that the UN is kind of a big failure in so many areas. Not all, I want to be clear about that, but a failure in so many areas, and yet whenever these things are raised, you always get told, well, it just hasn't been around long enough to solve all of these problems it's got, including corruption, incompetence, inefficiency, but also just plain old wickedness and anti-Americanism. And just give us time, and every day you get told the same thing. You just give us more time. There will be this glorious tomorrow, and you have to live with all the badness in the present because, that justifies what it'll be, what it's supposed to become. So you wind up, in effect, taking the future and using it, taking the present, and it's all its bad stuff, and being held hostage by this rosy vision of the future that never quite comes about.
All right. Now, I understand that you have had a lot of experience with the United Nations, going back to the Treaty on Landmines.
Yeah, and so I'm somebody who I guess I'd say over the course of the last 25 years has drifted somewhat to the libertarian right. And I started out life in the NGO world, and I don't think it'd be fair to identify the organizations
That's fine.
I worked for, but I was one of the people that really pressed forward the original Landmines Convention, which I think was a good thing to do, actually. And in the course of those discussions back in the early 90s, there was a lot of discussion about what should come next, and one of them was, well, pretty clearly there's a need. The concern at that point was you had the vast, vast arsenals of the Warsaw Pact suddenly being sold out and flooding all of these countries at very, 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 very cheap prices in Africa and various other places. And I think that was actually a legitimate concern. But the movement very quickly got taken over by domestic gun control advocates. And I remember being in conversations and saying, folks, whatever good things this treaty, effort, this campaigning effort might achieve, if it's trying to essentially prevent arms from going to really bad guys in places where a lot of the times there isn't really a good side or a bad side. There's just some really bad actors out there. But whatever it's going to achieve, it will not achieve anything like that if this winds up in any way getting combined with domestic arms control. And that's, of course, naturally what happened.
Right. Absolutely. And so, now here we are looking at the arms trade treaty negotiations, and, we've been told all this time, civilian gun owners don't have anything to worry about. This isn't about you. It's about, disarming child soldiers in Africa and making the world a better place. But yet, Kenneth, when, gun owners asked, all right, well, can we just make that explicit in the treaty? Well, no, we can't, because then the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, and Guess I'd say, let me be fair to the UN. There are some things that it actually does well. The world needs a place where people can get together and argue over their differences and, if possible, find a way to avoid fighting over them. So, a sort of conference table around which people can meet to argue stuff that's great. UN peacekeeping often does a pretty good job in places that the U.S. would like to see somebody imposing some minimal order, but we're not going to send U.S. troops into those places. So, there are things that the UN provides a useful function for. But the worst stuff, the stuff that is just an absolute it will end in tears, is where the U.S. walks in, and usually because of powerful domestic constituencies, in this case, the sort of the left-wing arms control groups and the folks that kind of push this agenda and have for many years, they wind up getting an ear in particular administrations, in this case the Obama administration, and make that their priority to say we want to engage with all this stuff. But the problem with this is that treaty negotiations can't possibly end well if they're going to wind up implicating fundamental values, particularly constitutional values in the United States. And the whole effort winds up being a complete disaster for nearly everybody because the United States, if it decides to enter into the negotiation in the first place, it gets told this sweet little song by all the campaigning advocates that say, don't worry, this is a consensus negotiation, so if you're really unhappy, you can just say no at any point and we won't be able to go there. Well, that works if you're a small country or a bad country because nobody, frankly, cares what you do, whether you live up to your obligation afterwards, whether you blow it off. Nobody actually cares. But if you're the United States and you're the biggest player in the world, then people are going to be paying an enormous amount of attention to you, and what you say actually matters. And so if we wind up walking into negotiations and we say we can't live with this and 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 25 other things, by being the biggest player and holding everything else up at that point, we essentially undermine the legitimacy of the whole process, and other countries are mad at us not just over the particular points, but over the fact that we've essentially undercut the whole thing. And one can understand why they're mad, because the real question is why we ever showed up in the first place, knowing that we really couldn't go where the rest of them wanted to go. And the best thing to have done was to have said right up front, we can't go there. We're not going there. We're not going to be any place remotely close to that. And yet we show up because the domestic campaigning gun control advocates are eager to find something that they can beat up the U.S. with and try to get small incremental changes around the edges of things in the United States. They know that they can't directly take on the Second Amendment, and so they wind up saying, don't worry, the Second Amendment will never get implicated here, but it's 100 other things that are raised by implication in the treaty that allow them to at least walk into a court somewhere, try to find a sympathetic judge either in the United States or outside the United States, and to sort of press uncertainties and additional regulatory costs on businesses engaged in this. So there are 1,000 ways in which one can actually burden the right to bear arms in the United States that don't require anything directly involved with the Second Amendment.
Talking with Kenneth Anderson from the Hoover Institution and also the author of the book, Living with the UN, American Responsibilities in International Order. Kenneth, thank you again, sir, for coming on the program. Hope we can do it again soon.
I would be absolutely delighted. So just give a holler at any point, and I'm always happy to come on and talk about this.
Thanks so much. Have a great weekend.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.